Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. Glad you could join us today. We are continuing our discussion through the Daodejing. Today we are on chapter 27, and I'll go ahead and share the screen here. So this will be kind of an interesting one. I'm going to just kind of jump into the text and we'll just start working through it here. So it starts off skilled. Oh, and let me just disclaimer up front. This is a complete hodgepodge of different translations that I brought together for this one. There are so many ways to approach this and so many different ways it was translated, and I wasn't finding one that just brought together all the ideas that I wanted to bring out, and so I kind of merged a lot of these together in a way that's kind of hard to decipher what came from where. But so just kind of be aware that this isn't any one particular translation, but kind of a mixture of several. But they're definitely in keeping with appropriate ways to translate, and definitely working with, competent scholars in terms of their different translations. So just FYI. So skilled walking leaves no tracks. Skilled speech is without fault or blame. Skilled counting needs no markers. So maybe I'll just give a moment here and see if you guys have any thoughts about what might be trying to be said here.
Like if you're the last one, I feel like is saying something, but I don't know if it ties in with the others. But like if you're completely present while you're counting, then you don't need to mark it down because you're present and you're likely going to remember where you're at while you're counting.
Anybody else have some thoughts?
I'm thinking about the first two being more about those sages and how we don't rule with ill intent, and how we don't abide by hierarchies and such. Something in that sense.
Okay.
To me, they all seem to have something to do with the idea of leaving no trace or having a small footprint.
Yeah. Kind of like
the first one actually, they seem, that's kind of a stretch for me though, because they seem to not quite fit together. That just seems to be the closest way that they appear to fit together. But the first one in particular makes me think of the way that deer walk in the woods. If you ever observe deer walking in the woods, they're pretty big, but they move very silently, and it's because they have small feet and they place them down very precisely and delicately. And it's like if you hear a person walking through the woods, it's kind of like or they're just pushing everything out of the way. But a deer, when they just step very precisely and lightly and make almost no sound at all. And I imagine, I mean, sometimes they leave tracks, but they probably leave much less tracks than they would if they were making a huge disturbance.
Yeah. Or you think about, taking it to kind of extremes. Obviously, they didn't have cars back in the day that this was written, but they would have something like carts, and you figure that's kind of rolling through the brush. It's definitely going to be laying down some actual tracks, right? And in a modern day sense, we definitely make an imprint in different ways in places that we go. There's definitely this idea of transforming things or changing things that we don't seem to take any concern about. It kind of reminds me of that, was it the Boy Scout motto? leave no trace. It's kind of funny. Skilled speech without fault or blame is kind of interesting. Again, counting, no markers. This isn't necessarily something where each of these needs to be tied together into kind of a specific like common thing, but it's definitely bringing up aspects of what somebody who's skilled in these things, some traits about that. And in just a minute, we'll get a little bit more of a sense of what these relate to. But I wanted to kind of just wrestle with the thoughts for a minute ahead of time so that it comes together a little bit more in the third slide here. So it continues with this idea of skilled, but now it's a little bit different. Skilled closing requires no bolts, yet the seal cannot be broken. Skilled binding requires no rope, but cannot be unbound. So we kind of turned a little bit of a corner with these two, in that it's showing again a skilled process, but then there's like a secondary aspect of it that it can't quite be undone. But what I'll suggest here is that if we're thinking about a door that doesn't require a bolt, but it can't be opened, that maybe we're moving into a little bit more of a metaphorical expression. Same thing if we're binding something, but we're not using a rope and somehow it can't be unbound. Again, kind of a metaphorical way of talking about something. Any speculations on what these might refer to?
Sounds like a fairy tale. Answer me riddles 3.
Yeah.
Well, I'm feeling a little bit more about individualism. As if things that I do have no impact. I do them in a way that have no impact on others. And I mean, just individualism per se, but like doing things without impacting the others and just not leaving, as I said, leaving no trace and not laying blame on others. When I say, good morning, I don't mean that you are responsible for my bad morning yesterday.
Okay. So are you referring back to those first three, or taking it to these?
I think the same thing I think how applies here, that if I'm skilled enough to do anything, I don't require anybody else's being impacted.
Interesting.
This is so meta. Sam should have been here.
Yeah.
I feel like I can at least think of parallel analogies, such as there's one way of building, for example, with brick and mortar, where, or with stones and mortar, where the stones are kind of stuck together. And then there's another mode of building that's been found in some ancient structures where there's no mortar, the stones are just cut in such a way that they fit together so perfectly you can't even slide a sheet of paper in between them, and gravity holds the whole structure together, and they're still standing after thousands of years. Or somebody who is not very skilled at a particular task might require advanced tools to get that task done, but somebody who's very skilled doesn't need the best tools, or they might even be able to do it without tools if they're good enough. Or they might be able to do it if the right tools aren't available and they have the wrong tools and they have to improvise, but they can still get the job done. They have enough skill.
Yeah. Definitely could see some of that here too. And I think that would tie in a bit with the first three, in terms of, really focusing on that capacity to do something without, as Martin was saying, that impact. So one of the ways, though, I think we want to think about these last two, because they definitely took a turn in the sense that they're talking about not being able to undo it. And I think because of that, we're definitely looking at something a bit more metaphorical that has to do with closing something off and also with binding something. And this is just my thoughts here. This is not saying that this is the definitive answer. But my thinking is that there's mental aspects that are going on here, that there are ways of thinking that are getting closed off, that are not able to be reopened. And there's ways of thinking that become so a part of the person that they can't be taken away, they can't be unbound. And the way I am thinking about this is that once we become exposed to certain things, like the Daodejing is really helping us to see things in a slightly different way that really opens up stuff that wasn't immediately obvious before. One of them that might be, that kind of comes to mind is you think about where they were talking about promotion or being recognized with something that they wanted to, the Taoists were saying you want to reject for a couple of different reasons. One, because it's implying an inequality between the actors. For you to be promoted, it means there's somebody who is above you that's actually enabling that to happen. It also comes with the threat that if you can be demoted, or if you can be promoted, you can also be demoted. And so they would say that whole concept, that whole idea of social rank really needs to be questioned. And once you start to see some of that, it becomes hard to not see it. Might be not easy to understand what we do with it in terms of, how do we operate in society, but we can see, this is an interesting maneuver, right, that's happening socially in terms of how control is trying to be executed in terms of creating these artificial ranks between people. And once that's kind of in place, we could almost see that as like closing off that way of thinking. It's like, yeah, I see what this makes sense to me now. I'm not going to get caught up in that game. And I recognize that that's something that's not right. And so that kind of gets closed off. And there's not something that somebody's going to like, dangle a big enough carrot for me to like change my mind on it. I might get caught up socially in situations where I'm not sure how to necessarily deal with it. But in terms of my understanding, I still get it. It's not one of those things that's going to change. But then there's also things that we acquire that would be like things that we bind that we like. So, maybe part of it is we're starting to see how these patterns work in the world, and this becomes something that we cherish and something that we hold on to, and it's not something somebody can take away. They can't unbind it from us. I don't know if that's for sure what's going on here, but it kind of is what came to mind here, is that there's this closing off of things and these binding of things that other people can't undo. And because it's more metaphorical, obviously a door that closed that cannot be opened, even if it's not bolted, that there's some kind of like metaphor going on there. And the same thing with binding something that you would normally use a rope, but you're not using a rope, and yet it still can't be unbound. That's just kind of where my brain went with those ideas. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but okay.
To me, there's something like what the feeling I get is that if the closing used bolts, then it could be broken, but it doesn't use bolts, so it can't be broken. If the binding used rope, then it could be unbound, but it's a binding that doesn't use rope, therefore it can't be unbound.
I like that too. That's
It's
fair.
like, it's yeah. If there was if there was a lock, there would have to be a key, but there is no lock, so there can't be a key, something like that.
Yeah, it reminds me of another part where it says, if you don't take credit, you can't lose it, right? You don't lose credit for something you did if you don't actually take credit for it in the first place. And that's kind of along the lines of what you're bringing up here. If there was a bolt, it could be broken. And if it was a rope, it could be unbound. But because it's not using either of those, it's not able to be broken or unbound. So taking that a little bit further, then where do you see that going in terms of what would be kind of the context for the idea of closing without a bolt? Is it the idea that the door can... Well, the thing is, it doesn't say that the door can be broken open. It's saying that it doesn't open, like the seal is not broken, right? So it wouldn't be that the door just, it's okay if it opens and closes. The idea is once it's closed, it doesn't open, but it's not using a bolt. And I like the idea because it's not a bolt that can't be broken in the normal sense. But what do you think it's getting at with the way you're looking at this without the bolt? Like, what does that mean?
I'm getting the idea of being resolute. More of my mind goes to, you say you're gonna, someone says, how do you feel about this? And you say no. Like, you're resolute about your decisions. Like, you just, or your can't think of the word, your beliefs or whatever cannot be broken. You stand resolute in your ideas or your beliefs or your thoughts, whatever you want to fancy word you want to insert there. That was kind of more the idea I was getting out of that statement.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are all good things, good ways of looking at it. So I'm going to go to the next slide here, and we'll kind of get a sense of where all this has been headed. So it says, in this way. So we can think about all 5 of those skilled things, about how the walking happens, how the talking happens, how the counting happens, and the closing and the binding. So in this way, the sage always helps people and rejects none. So we've got a couple of things happening here. So we're seeing that these are skills that the sage possesses that's used in the service or in the help of people. And then it says, but he rejects and rejects none. So nobody's kind of off the list of being open for the sage to be able to help, right? There's not a category of people that are unworthy of the sage's help or not able to have the sage help. So now this takes on kind of an interesting thought, right? Because if we go back a little bit, there we go. So now we can see, okay, maybe this leaving no trace, leaving no tracks is getting at more of the subtlety for how the sage actually engages with other people, right? Because we can think back to when it says, the sages, if you saw one, you wouldn't know it, right? They're kind of like invisible. They don't stand out. So maybe the way that the sage is going about this help is in such a way that the person doesn't even realize that they're like in a situation where the sage is helping them. It's just kind of like they're engaged in something, like maybe they're walking together, but they don't realize what they're receiving from the sage or how the sage is is maybe planting ideas in their mind. You've got this idea of the speech then is it's not got the fault or blame. And I think this is kind of interesting when it gets into all different kinds of people. Maybe the kinds of discussions that the sage is having isn't one where they're trying to find fault or blame in the other person. And, potentially the skilled counting is like not keeping a tally of all the stuff that they did wrong, maybe. Or maybe even not keeping a tally of all the things they did right, for that matter. Kind of an interesting way to think about these things then within the context of how does the sage help other people in a way that's kind of almost subliminal, like under the radar. They don't even necessarily realize that it's happening. And then lots of different ways, obviously, that this could be interpreted, but maybe this is part of the way that they start to plant these seeds or help different ways of thinking growing in that person in such a way that they, once you kind of experience it, you can't go back to having it be otherwise. We can kind of tease those out a bit, but it's kind of interesting that all of this is kind of coming back into this idea that ultimately the sage has kind of this desire to help all people, which is interesting. This is the first time they kind of brought up kind of this role of what is the sage actually supposed to be doing, or what does the sage do? And here we're seeing that the focus is on this idea of helping people, and for that matter, all people. Nobody's like off limits. And it continues and says, always helps all beings and rejects none. So here we have kind of that, again, elevation beyond just the human realm, but it's going to much broader context, whether we're talking about other living things of whatever kind, or even maybe just even environmental things in general. And it says, this is called practicing brightness. And that's translated lots of different ways, but definitely has to do with something around bright or illuminated or something along those lines. So after we kind of weave in this piece to the puzzle, how does that affect or impact the ways you're thinking about those earlier skilled statements?
Feels like I was right at the very, very beginning before I changed my mind.
This better than any of the guesses. I like the thought of helping people in a way that is subtle and they may not realize it. Like maybe you're just asking the right questions, or not saying anything at all and just listening to them.
Just being there, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this saying that if you're skilled in all these ways, you are just naturally going to be a beacon of sorts for people. That because you're so skilled with yourself and you have that way of being almost neutral or objective to the point of like you're very centered, then you become a beacon and you just will naturally help people, whether it's from physical interaction or just talking to them or just being like Taylor said, like just being there.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting, some of the observations coming up about, how they're present. And as we were pointing out earlier, that there's not a rejection of anybody. Everybody is there. And in the speech is not judgmental in terms of finding fault or blame, and not necessarily keeping a tally. All these things kind of lead to the type of person who's very open and accepting of others. And the people that stand out in my life, I'm like, wow, that's like, I really enjoy being around this person, or I'm impressed with the way they're dealing with all these other kinds of people, are those kind of people, right? That aren't like constantly judging other people. They're not complaining about all these things, but they're very open and they're very accepting. And I think it's that way of being present that brings in so much of the attraction, right? Like it's, I don't want to necessarily say charisma, because it's not like they're necessarily doing anything that's in what we normally think of as charismatic, but there's just a presence about them that draws us because of that openness. Have you guys met people like that in your life? Do you?
Yeah, it's
have,
like a warmth almost. Like
yeah.
you just feel comfortable with this person naturally.
I feel like you can just be yourself because they're not going to judge you for it.
Mhm.
So then you end up being more present.
Absolutely. So then the way this kind of closes out is fascinating as well, because it definitely, some of the different ways it's translated can come across a little bit, I might say it feels kind of harsh, but there's some different translations that I found that really, I thought, brought out more of this idea. Oh, I also wanted to bring up all the places that we saw skilled. In a lot of the translations, they use good. So a good walker, a good speaker, and I wasn't happy with that way of translating it. They're saying good in terms of good at, like good at walking, which is the idea of skilled. But when you just say good walker, then it starts to bring in some of those like value judgments that's already come under critique within, chapter 2, where it says, if you see some things as good, then that automatically brings up this idea of evil. And so I think it would be better to have more of these kind of like terms that are not as open to being seen as value judgments. You could affect that by saying good at, but then you end up with the flip side, which would be bad at, which also feels a little bit more like a judgment. Even if we say unskilled, it's still kind of could be taken in more of a value judgment way, but in another way, it's a lot easier to take unskilled as, well, they just don't know, right? As opposed to saying somebody's bad at something. So that's one of the reasons I really favored the translations that use the term skill. And then what we'll see in the next section here, definitely when you're using good and bad, it comes off sounding really kind of harsh. But it says, therefore, the skilled is the model for the unskilled. The unskilled is the origin of the skilled. Now, this is kind of interesting, because if we think about the whole like yin yang concept, that things transform into the next thing, into their opposite, here we have kind of that being brought out, that the unskilled is really where the skilled comes from, right? It's this transformation that happens. Let me just grab one of these other translations real quick. I don't have the Addiss. Oh yeah, I do have the Addiss one with me. Hold on just a second. Because when you hear how this is translated in some of the other ways it goes, I think you'll see why skilled really helps with this translation. So the Addiss and Lombardo translation that we normally work with says, therefore, the good person is the bad person's teacher. Right? So again, it's good at, like, not like good in terms of like, yes, they're, the good person, and bad is not evil, it's bad at, it's not skilled. And it just sounds almost kind of horrible. And then the flip side, it says, and the bad person is the good person's resource. And that becomes almost kind of like again, you get like this hierarchical kind of way of looking at the relationship between the two that I think is really not consistent with the overall theme that we're seeing within Taoism. And so I really like, and this is kind of a mix of a couple of different translations here as well, because skilled wasn't part of where we got this idea of the origin. They were using virtuous. So the virtuous is the model for the unvirtuous. But since previously and throughout we're using skilled, I'm bringing that back in. But this idea of the origin of the skilled, I think, is key to how they understand that flip side. It's not that the other person just becomes this resource or this asset, which it's commonly translated as, but it's really the origin of where skilled comes from. It's this, because we've talked about developing kind of that second nature where we acquire ways of doing things like learning how to type or learning how to drive that suddenly become things we don't even have to think about. They just happen naturally, and it's become kind of what we call second nature. So we become skilled at those things, and other people don't have those skills yet. It doesn't make them bad. It just means they haven't learned it yet, right? And so once they get exposed to it, then they can also become skilled, which means that the unskilled is where skilled comes from. It's not a it doesn't become like this battle between good and bad or good and evil. It's a continuum of movement between what somebody knows and how they've implemented it within their lives, that I think is much more akin to the overall flavor that we're trying to see within the Daodejing. And then it concludes, if one does not appreciate the skilled, so an unskilled not appreciating the skilled, or cherishes the unskilled. So this is, again, kind of bringing in both sides. If you happen to be skilled and you're not cherishing the unskilled, or if you're unskilled and you don't appreciate the skilled, although one is intelligent, one is not free from confusion. So the point here is that they need each other, and everything fits together within this kind of ongoing continuation of this yin yang between the skilled and unskilled. And how the unskilled acquires those skills is in part how the sage is going about the process, which, when we see the skilled way that happens, is in a way that's almost unnoticed. So it's like a non-coercive kind of sharing or being with that allows that transformation to happen. And then the final line is that this kind of understanding this whole process, it says, is called the vital secret. I like that. So with the remaining time, I want to talk a little bit about then what is this help? What is this skill that is wanting to be imparted to other people, right? So kind of break down some ideas here. One, and I think this is kind of at the core that was even brought out specifically in the text, is this idea of acceptance, both of self and of others. That when we can develop that sense of just being open and not fighting against like the diversity of things or things that are different than myself, but we can have more of a curiosity and a desire to understand, and we can be more accepting, that this is going to be at the core of what's being transmitted. When we're around those people that we talked about earlier that just kind of open up our feelings because we feel accepted by them and that they're not being judgmental, well, we can acquire that. We're motivated to be more like that when we're around people that we experience that with. And if we're then able to replicate that and carry that out to other people, I mean, just imagine how different, a lot of our social engagements would be if we were dealing with people that were much more accepting and open to the uniqueness of each other. And so there's a couple of things within what we've been looking at with Daodejing that help us to get to that point of how do we start to have that level of acceptance of others? How do we get past that idea of that judgment that's so easy for us to label people as good or bad? So one of them, and this isn't the terminology that the Daodejing uses, but I think is really where they get at a lot of this idea of these patterns that are recognized and how they engage with them in the world, is this idea of being determined, in the sense that there's an ongoing path, an ongoing way of being that has an impact on how we see ourselves and other people. The more we start to see that who I am is a matter of luck rather than choice, that I didn't get to choose, who my parents were, what their social economic status was, what kind of schooling I had, what kind of food I received, what time and place in history that I happened to be born, all have a tremendous impact on who I am as a person, and ongoing, the things that I've experienced and the things that I haven't experienced, and the things that I've been exposed to, all go into shaping what kind of person I am, how I behave, how I react to things. When we start to see that this is, potentially none of it is anything that we had control over, and that how these patterns in the universe work that we see, that there's this cause and effect to everything, mean that we need to really think about the idea of merit very differently. Did somebody actually deserve, either in a good or a bad way, the things that are happening to them in life? So we can take extremes and recognize somebody who was born, let's say, with a genetic defect in their brain, and they just are incapable of, types of behaviors that the rest of us take for granted. We wouldn't blame them for that. We wouldn't say, you caused this to happen in your life, and we would make, exceptions for how we would deal with their behavior. And it may be that it's very destructive behavior and we need to potentially remove them from society, but not in the sense of trying to punish, but more in the sense of kind of almost like a public health concern, in the same way that if somebody had a very serious, contagion, we would take them out of being able to contaminate other people, not because they did something bad, but we're trying to protect everybody. And so that gives a very different way of viewing their actions and who they are. Well, all of us are kind of dealing with that same thing to various degrees. And so whether it's a good or bad types of behavior, the more we can start to recognize that all of us are the product of this ongoing series of events that predate even our own lives, literally going back to the beginning of the Big Bang, then we can start to have a little bit more of an acceptance about and compassion for who people are. Even the ones that seem like the hardest to understand, or the ones that have committed actions that are, so difficult to get our heads around, we can have a different way of viewing that because of recognizing how these patterns work that allow that compassion and that acceptance, not acceptance in the sense of it doesn't matter if somebody does something bad. Right. And by bad, what I'm saying is something that society doesn't recognize as a lawful way of being, let's say. Right. So we don't allow people to just walk around killing each other. We don't allow people to, defame each other or beat up on people or whatever. Those are areas that we've deemed inappropriate for our social situation. So we're not saying that those things don't matter if somebody is behaving in those ways, but what it means is we don't try to have more of a retributive, get my pound of flesh response to somebody's actions. We can recognize that in the same way I didn't have any control over how tall I am, what gender I am, what color I am, and all that kind of stuff. I can't take any kind of credit for that, nor can I take any kind of blame for it. That same type of thinking applies to almost everything in life. And I know this is a hard one for people to kind of get their heads around. And so I'm not expecting that this is something that everybody just immediately gets on board with. But if we're able to start to appreciate some of those aspects, it definitely opens up the windows of compassion for how we view other people, but also how we view ourselves. And it allows that greater degree of acceptance and how we think about change in different terms. Not about you're a good person, you're a bad person, you need to be rewarded, you need to be punished, but in terms of how do we encourage and work with even more of kind of a whole environmental, social, structural kind of way of thinking about encouraging the kinds of things that we would like to see in society. The other piece of this then that's, I think, critical is when we think about if we are all part of this kind of cause and effect chain, each of us is extremely unique, but also essential. So go back to your, fifth great grandmother. You might not have any idea who she is. Most of us don't. Everything in her life had to unfold in the way it did, and everything after her life had to unfold in the way it did for you to actually be here. Everything was essential, but also everything after you and during you is also essential for what comes next. So there's a very unique place that you have in the universe as part of this ongoing causal chain that nobody else can do, that is going to have rippled ramifications in a very real sense throughout the universe, which is really kind of crazy to think about. And we're here, each of us, as kind of a front row seat to being able to see this as the way to actually experience and see and be a part of what's happening in a way that is unpredictable. Even though we're saying everything is determined, we don't know how it's going to unfold. And everything that we experience is going to continue to add to how things unfold and why it's so important we have the ability to learn and be able to make changes in that regard. And we talk about the no control, that kind of ties it all together, but really grasping this idea of how much luck actually plays a role in everything, and not necessarily that somebody was just better or worse at something, opens up massive space for compassion and acceptance that really helps to figure out how do we show that compassion and that acceptance to those that seem like it's impossible. And sometimes that might even be ourselves. So that would be one huge key aspect I see. The other is that we tend to seek love and validation from outside of ourselves. And so part of what I think even Taylor brought up earlier is, just being with someone, right? This idea of how do we just be who we are and fully accept ourselves. And part of that acceptance is, going back to what we just talked about, allows us to have this greater sense of, acceptance of ourselves, which becomes a source of love, not just for how we feel about ourselves, but how we're able to interact with other people. So we can't get caught up in the idea that the validation and the love from other people is how we ultimately have it, but it's kind of like almost more like that yin yang thing, right? Where yes, it's good to experience being loved and have that validation from others, but ultimately that has to work into how do we have that sense in ourselves and not be dependent on other people having to show it to us, right? It's kind of this evolving from initially needing to receive it to then being able to internalize it and then being a source of it for other people, but not in the sense that they need to become dependent on it, but we are no longer like the needy part of it. We're the part that can, because we are it, it just emanates in the same way that acceptance just emanates, and it creates a context that people just seek out because it's comforting. It's this way of feeling, ourselves and being able to be accepted. And then also definitely tying in with what we were talking about, this whole determinism thing is about the understanding about what does it mean to be human. Everything is imperfect. There are no perfect people. There's nothing that's going to be perfect with everybody. We have to really get on board with this idea that if we appreciate life, part of what life is a bunch of imperfect things. And also that everything is constantly changing. Nothing is permanent. So those would be another part of what I think is part of that help that the sage is working to pass on. And then the final part that I'll stop on is leaving this idea of certainty behind, that we need to recognize there's no way to know everything about anything. we constantly are dealing with just a very small subset of information about something, and we need to recognize that when we start to think we know all the answers, that we know exactly what happened, we know exactly who is at fault, we know exactly ... that we get ourselves into trouble, because then we feel justified in making decisions, and sometimes horrible decisions, sometimes massive world-changing decisions, because we think we have this level of certainty that's not justified. There's no way to have that level of certainty. So the more we can be have a sense of humility about what we think we know, this will definitely help with all those other categories that we talked about above. So I'll stop talking for a minute and see what you guys have to say about all this.
That was the last part was really good. I really like that. But I have to be fair, I'm having a hard time kind of pairing it into what we've heard so far, because it seems very social justice forward, when everything up until now was more about the overall being and the overall higher levels of thinking and doing and considering. And this is like very, hey, be good people. So I'm happy to see that, but it just doesn't kind of fit into this what we've been doing until now. Also, I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, in the past we have talked about how the heaven and hell situation was a problem, and how by casting judgment and being the hierarchy of better or worse, as you said, the good or evil, is just not part of the Daodejing. This kind of feels like it's indirectly going against that, especially when you said the skilled and unskilled, and putting the hierarchy in there, while at the same time trying to not put the hierarchy by saying you gotta cherish the unskilled. Is it just me seeing those discrepancies there, or am I just not understanding it as well?
Well, I think that part of what I've tried to keep in mind as we go through the Daodejing is that it is advocating for a certain way of being. It's not a disinterested document in the sense that, hey, just everybody get along, let's not do anything. It's very much promoting or advocating for a way of life that recognizes the Tao, and the more that we participate in a harmonious way with Tao, the greater the social outcome is going to be in terms of how we get along, as also how we engage with our environment, and looking for to use more modern day terms, sustainability and, socially harmonious ways of existing in the world. So the skilled and unskilled would have to do more with how well versed and practiced one is in that harmonious way of being with Tao. The unskilled would be someone who's either ignorant of or just doesn't know how to do it. So it's not trying to create the hierarchy in terms of above and below so much as it's saying, this is all of a piece. Again, if you think about that yin yang symbol where one thing transforms into the other, the unskilled is essential because it's from that place that you end up with the skilled. And so you can't dismiss or write off or view as unworthy or below the idea of the unskilled, even though it's hard for us to think about, it seems like they're saying skilled is up here and unskilled is down here. I totally get that, but they're intentionally trying to make the point of thinking in terms of that yin yang way of viewing things as opposed to the stepladder way of looking at things.
Okay, I hear you. I was thinking about, to be fair, I was thinking about how this whole principle is more neutral, but I see what you're saying when you say that there is actual promoting of certain style of being or living or approach. So yeah, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. I know it's a lot of different ways of talking about things that are a little foreign to us. So. Yeah.
I have a question for later. I will have others to chime in as well, but I have a separate question for you later.
Sure. Anybody else have some thoughts or ideas?
I think it's a lot harder to have compassion for yourself than it is to have compassion for others.
Mm. Do you find this determined way of looking at things and the role that luck plays in our world helpful in opening up that window for compassion?
I don't think so, because there's really you're still dealing with the issues either way, it's hard to find ways to deal with the things that you can't change.
Yeah. Well, but
and you
there's
reason others. Sorry, Jim.
That's okay. I was just going to say that the thing that maybe helps in this regard is, let's say you were born with type 2 diabetes, right? Or, I'm sorry, not type 2, type 1, be the one that you're born with. It would be inappropriate for either the parents or the child to carry guilt about that. They definitely have something that's different than what other people have to deal with, but they can at least approach how they deal with it, not from a place of guilt and shame, but from, okay, I understand a little bit more about, what my particular limitation is and how to, get started. So that would be part of the way that it opens up that realm of let's say acceptance of compassion, because it's not, I'm not seeing myself as to blame for it. Everybody's got their unique place of things that they have to deal with, whether it's temperament issues, bodily genetics that could infect, different kinds of diseases, or being prone to overweight, or, fast or slow or whatever, right? I mean, all of us here have very different, things that we deal with. It's that guilt and shame part that becomes really debilitating and difficult for the idea of acceptance and compassion. And if we can recognize that part of it isn't there, then we can move forward in terms of how do we address the particular issue that we happen to be dealing with. I know it's easier said than done sometimes, but the more we reflect on this, and really take time to internalize how life actually unfolds, it creates that space. And it doesn't just happen just because somebody tells you it. You have to really work at, how do I internalize really seeing the world from this perspective?
Yeah, that's hard.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
are,
there's a lot of work to do.
yeah, we are kind of at time. Martin, if you want to ask your question real quick, and we'll see if we can do kind of a
That's
quick.
okay. I'll maybe ping you later, and we can
Okay.
dive into it in one of your ad hoc sessions on the road.
All right, guys. Well, I super appreciate everybody being here today. And if you'd like to be a part of these live discussions on Zoom, you can sign up at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get emails with links to our Zoom link, as well as locations for the in-person if you'd like to join us there if you're in the Southern California area. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and we'll see you all next time.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.